Good morning, everyone. Today is Sunday, the 7th of March, 2021. Thanks for being with me this morning in our study. This morning, we will continue our New Testament study today in week 10 of this year's curriculum study, and that brings us to the text of Titus. So if you have your Bibles handy, you can turn to the letter, Paul's letter to Titus. And if you have your week 10 study guide handy, that might be helpful as well. As I noted, Titus is a very similar book or letter to 1 Timothy. It is written from Paul to Titus. It's a personal letter, but it's quite as personal as Paul's letter to Timothy. We don't know as much about Titus from the biblical account as we do about Timothy. Paul does make the statement in verse 4, for instance, when he's titling the letter. He says to Titus, "My true child in a common faith," and so certainly there's some tenderness in that expression. It might also indicate that Paul was the one that converted Timothy. Some scholars believe that is the point of that reference of a true child in a common faith. And so in either case, it's Paul certainly knew Titus well. But there doesn't seem to be the same tenderness as there does in 1st and 2nd Timothy. It seems that Paul was probably a little bit closer to Timothy. But in either case, here he writes this letter to Titus, giving Titus really a very similar message that he did to Timothy in 1 Timothy. He has some specific things on his mind that he wants to convey to Titus as a young evangelist. Again, much the same. There's a great deal of similarity between 1 Timothy and Titus, and so I would encourage you just the structure of them. Notice I put a general outline in our study guides, and so you could go back and look at the study guides for 1 Timothy and take a look at the structure or the general outline of both of these letters and note that they're pretty similar in nature. One of the great similarities that obviously exist are the qualifications of elders and deacons are mentioned only in 1 Timothy and Titus. And we're going to come back to those again, just as a reminder, in 2 weeks. We'll be dedicating 2 class periods to the qualifications in the work of and how those qualifications relate to the work of elders in churches. And so we'll come back to that as a topical study. So Titus, very similar in tone and structure to 1 Timothy, a personal letter from Paul to Titus. It is Paul. Not sure where Paul wrote this from, although he does mention Nicopolis in this letter, late in the letter. That may give us an indicator that that he was in close proximity, and therefore he may have been in Macedonia, but he might have been in Asia, he might have been in Greece. So we really don't know where Paul was when he wrote this letter. We do know a little bit about Titus from other texts. Number one, Titus was a Gentile. Galatians chapter 2, when Paul is talking about the hypocrisy that Peter and Barnabas was taken away in that occasion, Paul in Galatians mentions Titus as a Gentile convert. We also, Acts chapter 15, know that Titus was part of the Jerusalem Council, the conference there that was held about, well, what if any of the Old Testament and the Hebrew laws should Christians keep, Gentile Christians, and so he was part of that. According to several references in 2 Corinthians in chapter 2, 7, and 8, Paul sent the Corinthian letters by Titus. So he wrote First Corinthians, sent it by Titus. Titus brings the response back to Paul. Paul responds to the response in Second Corinthians and sends that ahead with Titus as well. And then now from this letter, we find out that Paul has left Titus on the island of Crete to accomplish some needed work there as well. And so that's kind of the historical background of this letter from Paul to Titus. So Titus is there on Crete. Chapter 1 and verse 5 says, "This is why I left you in Crete." In other words, this was your mission. This is the purpose that I left you there. I think it's probably, we'll see as he builds on this letter that there were several things that he wanted to do, but he certainly left him there. He says that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I directed you, which tells us more than one church on Crete, churches in several towns. And that Paul's mission for Titus, primary mission for Titus, was go around and appoint elders in those cities. And so not unusual. Obviously, we have seen we've seen Paul do that. If we go back even to his first missionary journey, it was kind of an out and back mission in Asia Minor, where he went to Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, Derbe, turned around. I don't have those in order, but you can look in Acts chapter 13 and 14 and put them in order. But he went out, came back, and on his way back appointed elders in those churches. And so this local leadership within each of these individual and autonomous congregations was something that Paul was emphasizing. He left that word with the qualifications with Timothy. Now he leaves them with Titus as well, with that mission: go and appoint those elders. And again, we'll talk about this in greater detail here in a couple of weeks, and so we'll come back to these texts. So then in chapter 2, if you'll notice there, he says, "But as for you, teach what accords with sound doctrine." So here's something that I want you to do. This is another mission that I'm going to give you, Titus, and I want you to teach what accords with sound doctrine, which that's important. That's similar to what we discussed last week from 2 Timothy about the idea of rightly dividing the word of truth. Well, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. If you can rightly do it, you can wrongly do it. I think that's necessarily inferred when Paul tells Timothy, you rightly divide the word of truth. He's implying if you can't mess this up, those instructions didn't need to be given. And so now he says, teach what accords with sound doctrine, which suggests to us there is unsound doctrine teaching. And so Paul is making the point to Titus. And I like the phrase that he used back in chapter 1 and 5 about putting things in order or setting things in order. And it seems that this kind of goes hand in hand with that. I want you to teach what accords with sound doctrine, with sound teaching, with sound theology. I want you to go in and I want you to teach what is proper, what is right, what is expected. And then he fleshes that out, and he fleshes it out by demographic, based on gender and based on age. So he says, I want you to teach the older men to do X. I want you to teach the older women to do X. I want you to teach the younger women and the younger men. So I want you to go in and work with these different groups. I want you, and again, very similar to what Paul told Timothy about how he should relate to these different demographic groups as an evangelist. And now Paul gave Titus these similar instructions. And actually, that's what we're going to be talking about this morning in my sermon at 10:30. So I don't want to go too deeply into it here because we'll talk about it talk about it in detail in our 10:30 service. Where we're looking at chapter 2, verses 1 through 10 specifically. But let's take a look. So if you'll, in chapter 2, if you'll skip down to verse 11, Paul makes the point, for the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ, who gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession, who are zealous for good works. That's a long sentence with a lot to unpack, as Paul is conveying several ideas in this single sentence to Timothy, or excuse me, to Titus. Let's start with the first phrase. For the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for all people. There are a couple of things I think that we can conclude from that text. That the salvation, the stated point of it is that the grace of God has appeared, and it brings salvation to all people. It doesn't necessarily mean that all people, in some kind of global sense, at the time that Paul wrote that, knew about the grace of God yet. That would emanate from this region over the period of centuries. But bringing salvation for all people, to me, is within the context of all ethnicities, of all genders, of all races. This is an all-encompassing. When he says all, he's talking about the human race, for all people. It's not exclusive to one group or another group. It's for all people. And I would also make the point that the grace of God has appeared. Is that I would argue that means it's fully appeared. There's no further revelation to be held in the future. What we've got now, what Paul had then to tell Titus, we have today. And so he makes this point about the grace of God having appeared, bringing salvation to all people, connecting salvation to the grace of God. A significant point. But then he makes the point in verse 12, turning to individual Christians, I think personally, training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions. There are certain things, and again, there is that word trained, and Paul has used that pretty consistently through his writing. And what that tells us is there's some individual effort. Training doesn't happen by osmosis. Training doesn't happen by accident. Training is an intentional and a deliberate effort. Anybody who's ever tried to get in shape for a road race, anybody who's ever tried to get in shape for some kind of competition or to learn some kind of new skill set, we recognize training is a deliberate thing. You got to get out there and you got to do it. And you have to learn some things. These are new things that you're learning, and you have to implement them to the point that and I don't want to suggest that we don't give thought to the way that we live and we just put it on autopilot. But I will tell you, I think that there is some form of like spiritual muscle memory that we should engage in, that there are certain things that we know are ungodly and unrighteous, and therefore that it is just an automatic conclusion when we are tempted or when we are faced with those things to reject them without question. Again, training a new skill set is something that we do to the point that we develop a certain muscle memory, that we can literally do something that we're not doing it at a cognitive level. It's happening in the background. It's muscle memory. So, whatever that may be, for a mechanic, it might be changing the oil. He might be able to put it on autopilot, and because he has done this thousands of times, and he recognizes that he can kind of put it on autopilot, and he can do those things and maybe be thinking about something else, but his hands are following the muscle memory that he has done so many times. Many craftsmen develop that point. There are things in my life that I have trained on so many times and I've done so many times that I don't have to do it at a cognitive level. It just happens when I decide it's going to happen. And so Paul made this point to Timothy about training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions. Now, he gives the flip side of that coin as well, or what would support that idea. He says to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. And I want to emphasize self-control. Paul juxtaposes that with ungodliness and worldly passions. Well, what's the contrast there? What do we juxtapose that against? Well, you've got ungodliness and worldly passions on one side of the spectrum. On the other side of the spectrum, you have a life that is lived self-control, upright, and godly in this present age. So in other words, Paul's saying you can do it. Paul is rejecting the idea that I'm only human. That's such a shallow excuse for letting our passions get the better of us. Not that our passions are not going to get the better of us. Sometimes they do. But we need to be willing and we need to be mature enough to say, I lost control. I didn't control myself the way I was supposed to control myself. And that led to ungodliness and worldly passions. Paul is teaching Titus this idea that godliness is connected to self-control. And we need to be reminded of this. God is not just going to zap us and it becomes easy. God is not, God is not just going to seal us from temptation. We've got to do our part. We are held responsible for our own actions, and we need to develop some self-control to renounce these kind of things. That's what Paul was telling Timothy here. But he also makes the point about looking forward. There's a reason that we apply some self-control, because we have a hope, and we look forward to we look forward to this blessed hope that Paul talks about here, reminding the reader again that Christ gave himself for us to redeem us from all lawlessness and to purify for himself a people for his own possession. That Christ gave himself so that he might have a people who are connected to him and would serve him and want to be in fellowship with him, both in the present age and in the one to come. And he makes this final point: a people for his own possession who are zealous for good works. He's talking about this relationship, this symbiotic relationship that we have with Christ in the here and now. We train ourselves to have some self-control, to stay away from ungodliness, to stay away from worldly passions, to not let this world get a hold of us, get its hooks in us. We keep our minds on spiritual things. We exercise some self-control. We stay away from sin. And then we give ourselves over in zeal to good works because of this relationship. And so that's such an important point that the apostle makes here in the latter part of chapter 2. Then in chapter 3, he's going to go on to make the point to Timothy that you need to be prepared for good works. This is kind of a personal older preacher to younger preacher idea on what he needs to do in regard to his own to his own life and the how he will relate to others in regard to his work as an evangelist. And you'll notice in this section from chapter 3, verse 1 down through verse 11, that there are both positives and negatives. So there are the thou shalls, you've got to do this, Titus, and the thou shalt nots, you should never do this, Titus. And again, I think very connected to his work as an evangelist, but real good advice for anybody. It's worthwhile whether an individual is an evangelist or not by vocation. These things are important for all of us. Down in chapter 3 and verse 10, he even gives a warning about people. I would understand this to be someone within the congregation, in other words, a Christian within the church there in Crete, who is a divisive person who's just going around stirring things up and creating division. And Paul says you got to do something about that person, and so he gives him some instructions about that as well, and then some final instructions and some personal things that Paul will share with Titus, and that concludes this letter. Next week, we're going to look at Paul's final epistle in our curriculum, and that will be we're going to go back a little bit to another prison epistle, and that will be the very short epistle of Philemon. And so we'll be looking at that next Lord's Day, if Lord willing. So thanks for being with me this morning. If you're going to be with us at the 10:30 service, we'll see you here in just a little while, or back here on the live stream. So thanks so much for being with me this morning, and God bless.